You ready for me? Okay. The directors are up here. Thank you for venturing out tonight. I would just like to say that we are taping this, and so at the end, if you have questions for Bill, if you could just let me know or raise your hand, and I'll come around with the hand mic so that everybody can hear the question, okay? And it's a pleasure to have everybody here to meet this man. He's just amazing. Bill is the son of David and Betty Woon. Dave was an original Canadian member of the 1st Special Service Force. Bill was born in Cut Bank, Montana, and grew up in Cut Bank and Shelby. He served in the United States Navy and is a graduate of the University of Montana and Montana State University. Bill and his family moved to Helena in 1984. It was in Helena that he met many of the surviving 1st Special Service Force veterans and became involved in the FSSF Association. Over the past 30 years, he has held the office of Secretary, Treasurer, and Executive Director of the FSSF Association. I'm sorry.
It doesn't roll off your tongue
No,
easily.
it does not. And is currently a board member of the association. Bill also serves as board member of the Lewis and Clark County Veterans Memorial Foundation. His career in Helena includes serving as finance director for Helena Industries, of Helena, now Helena College, Intermountain Children's Home, and business instructor at U of M Helena. Bill is married to Gail, and together they have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. And with all this going on, I just want to know if you ever get any rest.
I do.
Oh,
Yes,
good, good.
do.
Please join me in welcoming Bill Woon.
Thanks, Debbie. Can you hear me okay? I don't know if this is on, okay? I don't know if it's on or not. Did
Did you flip a switch here?
I could have. He was going to mute it and then turn it on. Over here. Screens, I'm not sure what button. We got it now? Okay? Okay. Well, thanks, Deb, and thanks for the Montana Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to share this story of the 1st Special Service Force. I'm going to wander around a little bit. I was going to drive the PowerPoint off of my narrative, but I think I'll reverse that because I could have a tendency to go down rabbit holes and tell stories and get off track and forget where I'm at on the screen and then realize that I'm about 5 screens behind of this story. But anyway, 1st Special Service Force. History, part of Montana history, military history, part of the United States and Canadian military history. They were a top secret World War II unit that was created in the early 1942, that trained right here in Helena, Montana out at Fort Harrison. The name 1st Special Service Force, that term service was actually deceptive. They wanted Germany, because Hitler knew that this unit existed or was being stood up, they wanted them to think that it was some kind of a service unit like the USO. So service was added to the name 1st Special Service Force. And you're right, it does not roll off your tongue easily. My father, Dave Woon, was one of the originals, part of the 800 Canadians that came down in 1942. Marilyn Hudson's father, Roy, was one of the Canadians that came down in 1942 to train. Just a little story about Dad. He was born in Coldwater, Ontario. It's about 100 miles north of Toronto on the Georgian Bay. Came down in 42. My mother was working for the Army Corps of Engineers at the time. And just a little side story of how Mom and Dad met. Les Owen, who was in the U.S. Army Band, was doing a documentary on the force. He's good friends with a lot of the members of the Pipes and Drums of the Black Devils. And Les was out here interviewing some of the surviving widows. Marilyn's going to start giggling. So anyway, Les was talking to these 4 widows about what was going on in Helen at the time and the force coming to town. And my mother was this little fiery redhead. She has since passed. But Les asked her, he said, well, Betty, what did you think when all these men came to town? And without missing a beat, she looked at him and she said, it was just like a smorgasbord. They were married in 1942 up in Cutbank. Dad survived the war. He has since passed. Came back to Montana after the war. They moved up to Cutbank. That's where I was born. And so the story goes on. Roy also came back. That was Hudson Furniture. Roy came back to Montana after the war. The story on the street, and this is where I'm going to start going down rabbit holes. I'll try to keep track here. The story on the street was that they couldn't be married, that it was a suicide mission that they were preparing for. They didn't know that at the time. The word on the street was that they just couldn't be married. Well, Mark Radcliffe and Edie Radcliffe got married, and Mark's commander, Monday morning when Mark came back to work, asked Mark what he had done that weekend, and Mark thought, man, I'm done. They're going to kick me out of here. He said, well, sir, I got married. And Colonel Walker looked at him and said, well, if you'd have given me a little heads up, I probably could have got you a couple days off. So that just opened the gates. And a lot of the men that came here married local girls and came back to Helena. Now, why was the force created? Let's talk a little bit about what was going on. And this is going to sound similar to some of the stuff we're seeing today. In 1939, up to 10 years prior to 1939, Hitler had been building his war machine. He had served in World War I. He didn't like the outcome of World War I. The Nazi party came into control in Germany. He had been building this war machine for 10 years. He wanted to return Germany to world dominance. He wanted to eliminate the Jewish population in Europe. He wanted to pay back the United States and England for their participation in World War II, in World War I. And he wanted to defeat communism, Bolshevism at the time, in Russia. Some of the timelines was in September, Germany moved in or invaded Poland. About a month later, 2 months later, Russia attacks Finland. Now, why did Russia attack Finland? Because Russia wanted a northern route into Germany. Russia and Germany at the time had a non-aggression pact. Stalin and Hitler had agreed on a non-aggression pact, which, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So Finland's defending themselves against Russia. So Finland aligns themselves with Germany to have access to Germany's war machine, war power, to defend themselves against Russia. Germany and Japan align themselves against Russia. The next spring, in April, Germany invades Norway. In May, June, Germany invades France, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. England knows that the invasion's coming. They're next. I'll bring up a map in a minute. You can see what it looked like. But England knows that eventually Germany's going to cross the channel and occupy England. So England comes to the United States asking for support. The United States isn't sure politically whether they want to get into another war. They just fought a war 20 years earlier in World War I. They're not sure they want to get into another war in Europe. A lot of the politicians at the time said it's a European war, let the Europeans fight it. Total strength, all branches at that time, and we're talking 1939, 1940, was about 500,000. The United States isn't prepared to get into a war. At the same time, Germany is starting to soften up England with aerial bombings in the Battle of Britain. England's holding their own on the air. They can't hold their own on the ground. I think I just said Germany's army was 2.5 million soldiers, just foot soldiers. So they knew that they could hold off the attack in the air, and on the sea, they weren't sure if they could get across the channel. There was too many German soldiers for them to hold off. In June of 1940, when Germany invades Russia, Hitler breaks the non-aggression pact that he has with Stalin. When you read and analyze what happened, I'm reading a book right now that talks about that specific event. Probably one of the mistakes that Hitler made, because now he's engaged his army on the eastern front, Russia's western front. It delayed the invasion into England because Germany at that time doesn't want to be fighting on two different fronts. Hitler thinks that if there is a mainland invasion from the Allies, it'll come from the north. He occupies Norway, but Finland is defending themselves against Russia, so he thinks it's going to come from the north. The United States still isn't sure they want to get in the war. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. December 8th, U.S. declares war on Japan. Now we're in a war. Italy joins the Axis with Germany and Japan. On December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. So now we're in it. Now we're in the war. This is what Europe looked like at the time. All the blue is German occupied. The red is the Allies. You can see England sitting out there all by itself. In January of 1942, Winston Churchill, Lord Mountbatten, and a scientist by the name of Jeffrey Pike come over to the United States with what was eventually called the Plow Project. They want to go into Norway. They want to invade Norway. Now, why Norway? At the time, Germany was ahead of the world in technology in 3 specific areas that had the Allies concerned. One was jet propulsion, and actually there were some jet fighters toward the end of World War II in the German Air Force. Rocket propulsion, and Germany had perfected a rocket enough that they could deliver conventional warheads into England with the V-2 rockets. The third one that really had their attention was what they called the super bomb, the atomic bomb. And the deuterium, or heavy water, that's used to refine uranium down to weapons grade was coming out of Norway. And the Allies had to stop that. If Germany would have been able to perfect the rocket and perfect the atomic bomb, there's a good chance that war would have turned out significantly different. The Allies wanted to stop that. The Plow Project that Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten brought over with Jeffrey Pike was the theory that you can fight a war in the snowfields of the north the same that you could fight them on the sea, on the water, if you had the right equipment, the right personnel, the right training, and they wanted the United States to create this elite commando force to go into Norway and eliminate or sabotage those heavy water plants. Also, hydroelectric was coming out of Norway, the electricity to feed the German factories. So it was presented to President Roosevelt, FDR, and General George C. Marshall, who was the Joint Chief of Staff at the time, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And they took a look at it. They handed it off to a lieutenant colonel at the time by the name of Robert T. Frederick. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick was tasked with analyzing this project to see whether it was even feasible or not. And he came back with a no-go. He said, you can't do it. One reason you couldn't do it was the estimated survival rate of that Norway invasion or that Norway occupation. And this was all going to be covert. It wasn't going to be a big mass invasion. The estimated survival rate of these men was 10%. 90% of them would be wounded, killed, captured, or succumb to the elements of the winter. But the bigger reason he gave for a no-go was because there weren't any aircraft available. The only aircraft available to get an armada of that size to drop soldiers into Norway was the British Lancaster. And the Lancaster was being used to defend England at the time, because remember, this aerial assault is going on, this air war is going on between England and Germany. So Lieutenant Colonel Frederick said, you can't do it. It's not feasible. Well, Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten continued to talk, continued to push. They couldn't do it themselves because of the number of men and the amount of equipment that was lost at Dunkirk and the raid at Dieppe. England just didn't have the resources to put this unit together. They took it to it's a position, it's not a person, it's called the Lord Lovat. He was commanding the British Commandos. He asked the British Commandos if they could do this. They said, we don't have those tools in our wheelhouse, and we don't have the personnel to take on this project. So Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten kept pushing the US to launch this project. The agreement was made that through Canada, the Canadians would supply half of the combat echelon, approximately 800 men. We'll talk about the structure here in a little bit. And because Colonel Frederick knew so much about the concept, the theory, he was promoted to colonel and given command of this unit. So the recruiters in the US and Canadian Army spread out all across the United States and all the Army posts and Canadian Army posts, recruiting men to serve. They were looking for lumberjacks, they were looking for miners, they were looking for loggers, they were looking for men who had worked and survived in the elements, again with the primary mission of Norway. Most of the Army posts didn't like to see these recruiters because they were taking the best of the best off of these posts and bringing them up to Helena, recruiting them to come up to Helena. It was estimated that they went through the selection process with about 16,000 potential recruits, and the cut came down to 2,200 that actually made the cut. And more than that came to Helena. We'll talk about that when we get into the training. But they launched the project on July 9th, 1942, at the War Department in Washington, D.C. The orders were cut to create this new top secret elite group unit called the 1st Special Service Force. And then on July 29th, 1942, at Fort Harrison, I'm going to get my pointer out here. Here's the service club. Here's the hospital. Fort Harrison was selected as the post that they would train on. Now, why Fort Harrison? The terrain is similar to the area of operation in Norway. The weather is similar to what they anticipated they would get into in Norway. And third, the post was available. There was another unit that came from Fort Harrison, the 163rd Infantry Regiment, and they're still an active component of the 163rd out at Fort Harrison. The 163rd had been mobilized after Pearl Harbor and had been moved out to the West Coast for coastal defense. The United States was anticipating some type of a landing from the Japanese, so the post was available. Just a little side note, the 163rd went for a year deployment to the West Coast and wound up spending 5 years island hopping in the Pacific. So two very significant units that had a significant impact on the outcome of both the Pacific theater and the European theater in World War II. So they selected Fort Harrison. All these these were their barracks or their huts or hooches or chews or whatever you want to call them. They didn't have anything for these guys to stay in. When they first got here, they just slept on the ground or lived in tents. These are just little 8x8 huts that they put a canvas top on, and that was the living quarters for all of the forcemen. Some of the officers were up here, and some of the command were in some of those houses over by the hospital. But that's what the fort looked like. These were drying towers for the parachutes. And then off in, I got to get my directions straight, off in this area was the range, a lot of the training area, their drop zone. They continued to train for this unconventional warfare. There was no manual to follow. This was an experiment. Nobody had a manual to follow in terms of how do you train these men for the mission that they're going to be expected to go on. It was put in the same context as Lewis and Clark. I mean, they just trained them for everything. They trained them for anything they could think of. The only thing they didn't train for was jungle warfare. They knew that they were going to go, anticipated that they were going to go into Europe. In November of 1942, oops, wrong button. That's not it. In November of 1942, the mission was given to the Norwegian underground. But what these men were training for at the time, the first one was airborne training, parachuting. The first thing they did when they got to Helena was airborne training. Colonel Frederick thought that if I can get these guys to jump out of an airplane, most of them had never been in an airplane, let alone jump out of one. If I can get them to jump out of an airplane, I can get them to do anything. Jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where it is now. Parachuting was fairly new, another concept that came out of Germany. Their jump school in Fort Benning is 5 to 6 weeks. First Special Service Force got 5 days. First day, they showed them how to harness up. Second day, they picked them up in these rigged up pulley systems where they would drop so they could get the feel of hitting the ground. Third day, you're going out of the airplane. 2 jumps, and you got your wings. Again, back to the concept, there was no provision for replacements. This was a one-and-done mission. They were training these guys to get in and do their job. That was it. Conditioning, and if you talk to these men, these forcemen, they would say that the training and conditioning was probably the biggest reason that they survived the war. Conditioning, this is going up the Bird's Eye, probably up somewhere around Austin. It was not uncommon for them to go on a 60-mile ruck march with a 60-pound pack. It wasn't uncommon for them to go on a 20 or 30-mile run and then come back and do hand-to-hand combat. The condition that these men were in, and when we get to the mountain climbing part of it. But this would have been a hike, and you really can't see it here, but they were hiking with poles because part of it was cross-country skiing too, and wherever they went with the poles to build up their shoulders and arms for when they got into Norway. Hand-to-hand combat was taught by a gentleman by the name of Pat O'Neill. And Pat O'Neill, Dermot O'Neill, he had been a policeman in Singapore, and he had developed his own form of martial art that nobody has equated to this day. He taught these men one thing: it wasn't to defend themselves, it was to kill somebody. And he taught them with a knife. I'll show the knife in a minute. But hand-to-hand combat, because these guys are going to be working behind the lines in close quarters. Most of their combat was going to be up close and personal with the enemy. They trained in demolitions. They had a new product called RS, which was Ryan's Special, and it was kind of a precursor to plastic explosives today. Dad had been a gold miner up in northern Canada, and he worked with dynamite. He was in the Royal Canadian Engineers, so that fit well. The demolitions fit well with what he had grown up with. Again, another side note. The force was asked to go blow up a bridge over the Kootenai River in Libby. It was about 3 miles out of Libby. The bridge was abandoned, and they needed to blow it up, get it out of the way. So they didn't take the whole force up, but for a training exercise, they took a bunch of the forcemen up there to blow up this bridge. The force thought, well, if a little bit's good, a lot must be better. They vaporized that bridge, and they blew every window out of the stores in Main Street, Libby, that was 3 miles away. They liked their toys. They blew up a lot of things around Helena, mines, mine shafts that needed to be blown up, some mine equipment, blew up some things that weren't supposed to be blown up. Colonel Frederick had to deal with that. They trained on weapon systems, both US and German. And that really came into play when they got in the mountains of Germany, because again, their operation was going to be behind enemy lines. And it was very high probability that they're going to get cut off from their supply lines. So Colonel Frederick and his staff had the foresight to train these men on both US weapon systems and German weapon systems. And there were multiple times that the forcemen, depending on where they were at, were cut off from supply, had to pick up German weapons to defend themselves. Mountain climbing and mountaineering, most of that was done over by York and the limestone cliffs down by Gates of the Mountains. That when we talked about conditioning, if their training for that day was to go climb mountains someplace around York or wherever the cliffs were, that they didn't get bussed over there or trucked over there. They ran over there. They went through their training exercises. When they were finished, they ran back. That's the condition that these men were in, and this conditioning played a big role when they got into Italy. There wasn't anybody that could keep up with them. And winter warfare, cross-country skiing, again, the Norway was the mission. This is up by Mullen Pass, up by Bossberg, where the train goes through the tracks, or goes through the tunnel there. They did a lot of their training up there. They would take the men up there in boxcars and live up there for a week and learn how to survive in the winter and cross-country ski and how to fight in the winter. They also were trained in navigation, advanced navigation, and night warfare. Now this is pre all of the GPS stuff that we have today. This was pre-night vision goggles. These guys did most of their work at night, and the training they got right here at Fort Harrison to prepare them for that was crucial in their ability to complete their missions and survive and to make it home. Now, like I said, there was no provision for replacements. There was no time to retrain. This was going to be a one-and-done operation. If you failed one test, if you didn't go out of the airplane, if you didn't make the 60-mile march, if you failed any one of those, you were out. It was just automatic. They didn't have time to retread you back through. You just picked up your gear and went back to the unit that you came from. Like I said, 16,000 were interviewed, 2,200 made the cut. In November of 42, the mission was given to the Norwegian Underground. They felt that the King of England, or the King of Norway, was in exile in England, and he really didn't want his country blown up. But the bigger fear was the retribution that the German army may inflict on the Norwegian citizenry with this sabotage mission. So it was given to the Norwegian Underground. The Norwegian Underground successfully eliminated that heavy water plant. And in the meantime, another side note, the OSS, which is a precursor to the CIA, they were able to get into Germany and get a lot of those scientists out of Germany before Germany ever perfected that atomic bomb. But Winston Churchill, now keep in mind the Canadians were always in the Canadian Army. So at any time the Canadian Army could have pulled those men back out. It would have been the end, possibly the end of the 1st Special Service Force. Prime Minister Churchill and Lord Mountbatten continued to push. Colonel Frederick now could see what they were creating. This small team concept wasn't big armies. It was small 9 and 10 man teams. They were autonomous. They were operating autonomous. So they pushed to keep it going, and Colonel Frederick pushed to get a new mission. They continued to train in Helena until April of 1943. This is the iconic picture of them marching down Last Chance Gulch on their farewell to Helena. This was a difficult day for both the Helena citizens and the forcemen because the bonds that had been created while they were here were pretty strong. A lot of these men, this was home to them. They had found home. A lot of the men married local girls, and a lot of the families in Helena would go out to the fort on a Sunday, pick up the soldier, take him to church, take him home for Sunday dinner. So the bonds that these forcemen had with Helena was really strong. They left Helena, went out to the East Coast on trains. They're going to get to see they're not going to get to see anything. They were on blacked out trains. But they crossed from Helena, well, they came out, most of them came from the East Coast. So they rode blackout trains to Helena, either across Canada and down or across the United States. Now they're going back to the East Coast on these blacked out trains for amphibious landing training at Norfolk, Virginia. They want to add amphibious landing to their wheelhouse, and so they train at Norfolk, Virginia for amphibious landing training. They complete that training. They go up to Fort Ethan Allen in Vermont to continue training, waiting for a mission, and the mission comes, and it's the Aleutian Islands. So now they got to get back on trains, go back to San Francisco, and prepare for an invasion not an invasion, a clearing of the island of Kiska that's on the outer chains of the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese were occupying a lot of these islands. The 1st Special Service Force is one of the few units in World War II that actually served in both the Pacific and the European theater. Japan is occupying this island of Kiska. So they board ships in San Francisco and head up to the Aleutian Islands. They're going to stage out of Amchitka, which is right there. The weather up there is nasty. It's cold and it's wet and it's foggy and it's windy. Well, on the way up, on the ships up, they got word that the USS Helena was sunk in the Pacific by a Japanese torpedo. Now this goes back to the bond that they had with Helena. They passed a hat to try to raise money. They put a tax on their card games and their dice games. They raised about $5,000, close to $6,000 to go to the Department of the Navy to replace the USS Helena. Well, the Navy couldn't take it. They sent it back to Mayor Hayden in Helena. He put it in the bank, contacted Colonel Frederick, let him know the money was there. That side note will come back around to how that money was used. So they made their amphibious landing on Kiska on August 15th, 1943, only to find out that the Japanese had left. They left under the cover of fog, and the Pacific was heating up, and I think probably Japan wanted those soldiers back. So the force, it was a good evaluation of the force's capability, but they still weren't combat tested. And while they were up there, getting ready to come back, Colonel Frederick gets a note from Lieutenant General Mark Clark in the Pacific, in the Atlantic in Italy, that he wants the 1st Special Service Force over in Italy. So they get back on ships, go back to San Francisco, get on trains, go back to the East Coast, and they deploy off the East Coast on October 23rd, 1943 for North Africa. Again, part of the deception. They want Hitler or want the Germans to think that this unit is going to North Africa to fight in North Africa. They made it to Casablanca on the ships, the Empress of Scotland. They boarded these boxcars, they're called 40 and 8s. There's one behind the Montana Military Museum out there. It's 40 men or 8 horses. And they went across North Africa on these boxcars, got back on ships at Oran, and went over to Italy, and arrived in Italy on November 19th, 1943. Now, what's going on in Italy? The Allies had landed at Salerno, came across Greece, liberated Greece, landed at Salerno, were working their way up the Italian boot when they ran into these defensive lines that the German army had built. And it was all the high ground that they had artillery, they had mortar pits, they had machine guns, they had snipers. They controlled everything that happened on the valley floor. When General Clark's army, the 5th Army, got about to this area, they got stopped dead in their tracks because there were a couple mountaintops that had to be cleared, as well as several other ones, in order for them to advance. That mission was given to the 1st Special Service Force because they're mountaineering. Now, we're in the winter in the mountains in Italy. The weather's pretty nasty. Colonel Frederick reconned the mountain. That's Monte La Defensa. That's the north face of it, so we're looking south. For about 5 weeks, the Allied Army had tried to clear this mountaintop. Ramatania is this one right behind it. Had tried to clear this mountaintop, but they couldn't. The southern route, the other side of the mountain, was the gradual route up. That was the German route, and the Germans had it all bracketed. When the Allies tried to come up there, it was a bloodbath for the Allies, to put it mildly. The force and Colonel Frederick decided that they would go up these cliffs on the north face. The reason he wanted to do that, Lieutenant General Clark thought he was crazy. General Keyes thought he was crazy. Because the Germans weren't patrolling or defending any of these cliffs. They didn't think there was anybody that could get enough men and equipment up the mountain to put up any kind of offensive. So the 1st Special Service Force, the night of December 1st, came around the valley. It was about a 10-mile hike in the rain and the snow and the mud, got up to the base of the cliffs by the morning of December 2nd, laid there all day. They could hear the Germans talking up on there. They could smell their cigarettes. They could smell what they were cooking for dinner. They laid there all day the night of the 2nd, or the day of the 2nd, in a cold camp, in the brush, undercover. Had the Germans known they were there, they would have been wiped out. The night of December 2nd, 4 scouts went up the cliffs in the dark, in the rain, and set the ropes, and about 200 of the forcemen, 1st and 2nd Company of 2nd Regiment, made it to the top of the mountain by daylight on December 3rd, and that's where the battle started. And within about 4 hours, the forcemen had pushed the Germans off of La Defensa. Many of them went down the south route, the Germans retreating. Many of them went over to Ramatania, but Ramatania had to be cleared also. That's a view from the top of La Defensa. You can see the strategic advantage that the Germans had up there. They had observers up there watching anything that moved. They had it all bracketed. They could put an artillery round in a water cup. So anything that moved up there that they saw move that wasn't authorized either got mortar fire or artillery fire. That's the Lira Valley, and here is La Defensa up here. This is Highway 6. We're looking north toward Rome. Again, you can see the advantage that the Germans had up there. So they went up the cliffs, cleared out the Germans off of La Defensa. I mean, that was their first introduction into combat. Casualties were very high. But what made that happen was the training they got here in Helena, the conditioning that they got, the mountain climbing that they got, the winter warfare, winter survival, to be able to get wounded men off of that mountain, as well as get water, first aid, ammunition up the mountain, was a tribute to their training. Just another little side note. They were up there for 2 or 3 days. Colonel Frederick called supply down in Naples, and he said, I need several cases of whiskey and I need several cases of condoms. And the supply sergeant said, what? He said, I need several cases of whiskey and several. He said, what are you guys doing up there? Well, the whiskey was to warm them up. The condoms went over the end of their rifles so it didn't get full of mud and water and snow, and they could shoot through it. You got to be creative. They spent the next 5 days clearing Ramatania because there was no cover up there at all. And so all of the movement had to be at night. If they could find a rock to hide behind during the day, they would. Again, the snipers, the mortar fire, the artillery. By December 8th, they had cleared Ramatania, and they were moving on to other mountaintops across the Lira Valley in order to work their way toward, let me catch up with myself here, toward the Rapido River and Casino. They continued to fight through the mountains. They got to the Rapido River and were relieved on January 17th, so they'd been in the mountains for about 45 days. Their initial combat strength, when they went up the mountains, their combat echelon, 3 regiments of 600 each, 1,800 men. Service company, maintenance company headquarters, total of 2,200 men, roughly. When they came out of the mountains, that's what they went in with on December 3rd. When they came out on January 17th of 44, fewer than 500 men got on the truck. 1,300 men were killed, wounded, captured, or succumbed to the weather and the elements of fighting in the mountains. When they came out of the mountains, they were given 2 weeks of R&R to regroup, to refit. By the time their next mission came, they were up to about 1,200 men. And their next mission was going to be Anzio. There's Anzio. Anzio was an end run on the German army. Here's Rome. The target was Rome. The main target was to push the German army out of this area. But the mission that they were trying to accomplish was the liberation of Rome. Here's where they were fighting in the mountains. They got on ships, went up to Anzio. Anzio beachhead was already secure. The Anzio beachhead landing was on January 28th. The force got there on February 2nd. So the Anzio beachhead was already secure. The force was given, these 1,200 men of the force were given the right flank. There were 3 sectors to the Anzio beachhead battle that lasted about 100 days. The force was given from this line down. That was their area of operation, was out in this area, along what was called the Mussolini Canal. When they landed on February 2nd, their strength was back up to about 1,200. Right across the canal was 12,000 German soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division. Colonel Frederick knew that he couldn't stand a full frontal assault. They would run right over him. They had 12,000 meters, about 8 miles, to defend with 1,200 men. Just simple math. If you put every man on the defensive line, you've got 10 yards between every one of them. So Colonel Frederick immediately went to the training that they received here in Helena and started sending out night patrols, small teams, to go out at night and just harass. And what he was trying to do was build a buffer along here and push the Germans back, keep pushing the Germans back. That was their entire area of operation. At one time, these were marshes, and Mussolini built this canal to drain the marshes so it could be used for agriculture. You can see the flat land up here. This was what here's the Mussolini Canal. This is what they were operating in. Behind that is the high ground, is the mountains again. Not the mountains as high as La Defensa, but they still owned the high ground. The Germans did. So again, anything that moved out there was subject to German artillery or German mortar fire. These are the houses that the force built. Here's a ground level view of their creativity of building some kind of living arrangements so that they could spend the days here. They're out of view of the German artillery. This is where they'd spend their days, and then they'd go out at night on the night missions. They were there for 99 days, and this is where they got the name of the Black Devils. They operated at night. They operated at stealth. They had a calling card. I can take this out for a second until security gets here. They had a calling card that they would leave around where they were working. Das Decke ende kommt noch means the worst is yet to come. They would leave those stickers. They would go out at night, and they were trained in hand-to-hand combat. They were trained to operate in stealth. This is going to start sounding a little gruesome, but they were trained to kill somebody and not make a noise. With this knife, the V42 knife. V was for victory, 42 was for the year it was made, and that knife had one purpose. This is a replica of the knife. They would go out on and it's small teams operating in this area. They would go out at night, maybe it's to just get intelligence, to see where the strongholds are, see where the German artillery is, where the machine gun nests are, where the mortar pits are. It may be to capture some German soldiers to get some information. It may be to engage them, and that's where the psychological warfare, the PSYOPs came in, was they would identify, and I'll just say a mortar pit, 3-man mortar pit. One of them, it's at night, one of them is awake, one of them is on guard, the other 2 are sleeping. They may sneak up, and the guy that's awake, they may eliminate him, put one of these stickers on his head, or they may eliminate the 2 that are sleeping, put the sticker on their head, the other guy wakes up or comes back to get his relief. They're 10 feet away from him. These guys are laying there dead. With this, the worst is yet to come. Or they would go into a camp, and they wouldn't bother anything. They would just put these stickers around just to let the Germans know that they were there. They would go into tents in a camp full of German soldiers, and they would kill 2 or 3 of them, and they'd put that sticker on their head, and they would leave. And it really messed with the Germans' minds. The Germans didn't want anything to do with these guys. They had pushed that buffer back from 100 yards when they got there to almost 3 miles by the time the breakout came. I better put this away before I stab myself with it. It'll be up here if you want to see it. So they fought for, in that type of environment, for 99 days on these night patrols, going out on these night patrols. I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the things that upset the forcemen more than anything was they got an artillery barrage one day, and that little colt and her mother both got killed from an artillery barrage, and that was fighting words for the forcemen, because the forcemen brought back cows and they brought back whatever they could find for booty. But the killing of those 2 horses really resonated with the forcemen. On on May 23rd of 1944, the breakout came, and the force wanted to go out a couple days early, or at least 1 day early, to clear out some of those areas that they'd identified, artillery encampments. The politics at the time was, it was a race to see if Canadians or British or US, who was going to be the first ones to be the first unit into Rome. So Colonel Frederick did not get the clearance to go out the night before of May 22nd. They went out at daylight on May 23rd. They had to cross that open area. The Germans still hold the high ground. It was the highest daily casualty rate for the force in the history of the force. And I'll qualify that by saying that, this thing's pulling on my ear, that most conventional commands, most conventional generals, most conventional commanders really didn't understand the concept of this unconventional warfare. And the force was utilized for a lot of things that, had they been utilized for what they were trained for, would have made a significant difference. And coming back to Winston Churchill made the comment one time, if he would have had 2 more General Fredericks, the war would have been over 2 years earlier. So anyway, they paid the price. They went up into the mountains. They started clearing villages, started clearing German strongholds for the next 12 days. And then we're entering into Rome for the liberation of Rome. The 1st Special Service Force, and then Captain Mark Radcliffe. Mark lived here in Helena. Some of you may have known Mark. He led the first patrol into Rome at 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 a.m., on June 4th, 1944. Rome became an open city. The Allies moved in. The Germans were retreating north. But the significance is June 4th, 1944. 2 days later is Normandy, June 6, 1944. So why did the Allies spend so much time in Italy when they're building for this invasion of mainland Europe? Invest all the time and men into that. Well, first, they could have barricaded, they could have cut off all the supplies to Italy, but that would have, the Italian citizenry would have paid the price for that. This is a little girl giving a flower to one of the forcemen as they got into Italy, or got into Rome. But secondly, the invasion on June 6th is coming from this area. By tying up approximately 300,000 German soldiers in Italy, they were able to keep them from being available when the invasion came over here. Hitler thought it was coming from the north. Russia is still fighting on the east. They're tying up soldiers here. Had they decided to do that differently, Normandy may have been a different outcome if the soldiers had been available. So probably one of the principal strategies of tying up those soldiers in Italy was to make them not available, because they knew that they were going to go across into southern France or into western France when they crossed the channel. Okay, final mission. They came out of Rome, a couple more weeks of R&R. They start training for their final mission, which was Operation Dragoon, which is the amphibious landing on southern France. The force's responsibility are these 2 islands. The Germans had artillery on those islands. The approach is going to be right through here of the main landing force. So the artillery had to be cleared off of these islands before the force, or before the main landing party could land. Otherwise, they're just going to pick them out of the water. So on August 15th, 1944, 1 year to the day after Kiska, the force lands on these 2 islands, clears the artillery, moves on to the mainland, and works their way up the coast to the Franco-Italian border, liberating villages, liberating French. They called it the Champagne Campaign, because this is the Riviera. This is a pretty nice area to be operating in. And made it up to the Franco-Italian border, and they were ordered to halt once they got to the Franco-Italian border. The German army is retreating. Big armies are fighting big armies on mainland Europe. And on December 5th, 1944, the force is deactivated. Now the question is asked, if you had a unit that was this effective, why would you deactivate it? Well, the main recommendation came from Colonel Frederick, who's now a brigadier general. And he said that because of the attrition rate, because of the men that they had lost that had trained in Helena, that had that capability to operate in that environment, had been so diluted with replacements because there was no provision for replacements. They trained them as best they could. They had a 2-week crash course in Naples and in Italy to bring the replacements in and teach them the tactics of warfare, teach them the weapon systems that they had. By the time they got to southern France, some of the men that were with the force at that time weren't even airborne qualified. So Colonel Frederick felt you can't continue to give this unit those kinds of missions because they don't have the skill set or enough of the skill set to continue. So it was deactivated. The Canadians wanted their Canadian soldiers back. Big armies are fighting big armies. They didn't understand the need for a small, what I'll call surgical unit like the 1st Special Service Force. When it was deactivated, the Canadian soldiers were ordered to fall out. These are the Canadian soldiers parading in front of the US soldiers as they boarded trucks to head back to England. The US soldiers formed a unit called the 474th Infantry Regiment that continued to fight as part of the 7th Army. They were some of the first soldiers into the Buchenwald concentration camp. And ironically, they wound up in Norway after the war. Norway was going to be their first mission. They wound up in Norway after the war, repatriating the German soldiers back to Germany. So the force was ended. Now back to the sinking of the USS Helena. The money that was put in the bank in Helena when the war was over, Colonel Frederick and Mark Radcliffe was an engineer, and a lot of the forcemen that came back to Helena and the surviving forcemen themselves, they formed an association that is still alive today, for Special Service Force Association, and they used the money that had been collected on the ship to build this monument. And this is the monument in Memorial Park. It was dedicated in 1947, the first reunion, on August 15th of 1947. That's what the monument looked like at that dedication ceremony. This is what it looks like today. And the cenotaph behind the monument lists the names of all of the men, the 488 men that were killed in action during the war. In their 251 days of combat, when they came out of, after the force was deactivated, from December 3rd of 43 to December 5th of 44, they had been in combat for 251 days. They had 2,314 casualties, 134% of their combat strength. They captured roughly 30,000 German soldiers, and they never lost a war. They never lost a campaign. They never lost a battle. Like say, those men that were killed in action, their name is on the wall. Behind, you can see it a little bit, is a Lewis and Clark County Veterans Memorial. That memorial was dedicated in 1949, 2 years later, and it contains the names of 126 Lewis and Clark citizens that have made the ultimate sacrifice in the wars. Now, in 2011, then Montana Senator Ryan Zinke read a proclamation on the floor of the Montana Senate recognizing the 1st Special Service Force. About 2 weeks later, then U.S. Senator Max Baucus nominated the 1st Special Service Force for what's called the Congressional Gold Medal. This is a replica of that medal. This is in 2011. For the next 4 years, the members of the 1st Special Service Force Association advocated for the support for that bill. It's a bill in Congress. It's the highest medal, it's the highest honor that Congress can bestow. It's a congressional equivalent of the Medal of Honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's awarded by the president. We found out pretty quickly that nobody had ever heard of these guys. So we spent 4 years, instead of lobbying and advocating, just educating. The bill was passed in 2013. The design of because every medal is unique to the unit or whoever receives it. And on February 3rd of 2015, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the 1st Special Service Force. These two gentlemen, these two veterans, Eugene Gutierrez, currently 100 years old, still living, down in McAllen, Texas. Charlie Mann was Canadian. Charlie passed away a couple years ago. Charlie represented the Canadian forcemen. Eugene represented the U.S. forcemen. Little side note, Eugene, his goal was to do 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups on his 100th birthday. He didn't do them all at once, but he did them. He did them. So then, that summer, fall of 2015, the forcemen wanted to bring the medal back to Helena. So a gold-plated replica of the medal was presented to General Quinn at a ceremony out at Fort Harrison and the half rack, presenting the Congressional Gold Medal back to Fort Harrison. Here's Eugene again, Eugene Gutierrez, and Hank Planger. Hank lives up in Alberta. Hank's 103, still going. And another little rabbit hole I'll jump down. We had one force veteran, Melcher Rolera, lived in San Diego. He would have been 35 or 36. He lived to be 110. So that's how resilient these guys were. That medal was presented, and it's out at the Montana Military Museum. The original medal is down at the headquarters, Special Forces Command headquarters at Fort Bragg. Now, the lineage of these forcemen, I'll talk about the Montana Military Museum, and then I'll come back to that history. If you haven't been out to the Montana Military Museum, I would highly recommend it, because the displays they have out there of the 1st Special Service Force, the other side of that area is the 163rd Infantry Regiment. It's amazing what they have on display out there. This is a mock-up of La Defensa, and it was done by GPS, so it's pretty accurate to scale of what that mountain looked like. In the history of the U.S., in 1952, the United States Army stood up what's called the 10th Special Forces Group. And the reason they started with the 10th is because they wanted the Russians to think that there was 9 other ones someplace else. It's still the 10th, out of Fort Carson. In 1960, President Kennedy reconstituted the 1st Special Service Force as 1st Special Forces. And that's alive and well today, with 7 different SF groups around the United States. In Canada, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment stood up in 2006, and although they serve under U.S. command and Canadian command, these units still operate together all over the world. And oftentimes, they will take off their unit patch and put on the spearhead when they're downrange, operating in whatever area they're operating in. So that, one more thing. This July 9th, put it on your calendar, it's a Saturday, the Special Forces Association Chapter 28, which is the Montana chapter, they call themselves the Devil's Brigade chapter. It's former Green Beret. The chapter's right here in Montana. They and the Canadian Special Operations Regiment Association are organizing an 80th anniversary of the formation of the 1st Special Service Force at Fort Harrison. It'll be a Saturday morning event. The public's going to be invited. We're still in the planning phases of that. We hope to, depending on what's going on around the world, we hope to have active duty giving some demonstrations. We're trying to secure an old C-47, the fixed wing C-47 Dakota that the men jumped out of in their airborne training, so that they can do a static line jump. They're going to do some halo jumps, high altitude jumps. They're going to have some weapon systems on display. It's going to be one morning. But anyway, if you're interested in coming out, it's going to be open to the public, and there'll be more information coming out later. So that's my presentation. It's an incredible story. And
That was amazing.
you wonder why the story didn't come out earlier, even where it started. And I put it, when we were advocating for the Congressional Gold Medal, they were a small unit at a time of big armies. They were well-trained soldiers. They were told not to talk. And for 75 and 80 years, they have not. And it's like peeling back layers of an onion. It's hard to find this in any one place. And we're down to 22 surviving force veterans, 6 in Canada and 16 in the United States, and 7 of those 22 were originals that trained here in Helena, and we're hoping to get a couple of them out here for that July 9th ceremony. The youngest is 97, and the oldest is 103.
Amazing. So where do they do the training for special forces now?
They do it depending on where they're going, where their area of operation is, but they do a lot of training here in Helena. This is their, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Masada, where the Israelis were defending themselves against the Romans. It was a mountaintop. True story, but the Israeli soldiers go up there every year. That's their pilgrimage. That's where they go. The Special Forces soldiers come here on a pretty regular basis. You don't see them, but you're not supposed to see them. I mean, that's how they operate, that train here. So a lot of it is still done here in Helena.
Can I answer part of that training?
Yes,
The training is mainly done at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in an area called Camp McCall. And it is a small, locked out area that if you don't know, you don't know. Very much like the First Special Service Force.
Does
Questions?
anybody have any questions for Bill? What was the
Well, thank you.
average age of the when they started recruiting the men? What was the average age?
I
of
would
the
say probably 22, 23. There were a few that lied about their age that came in at 16. There was one forceman that was going up the cliffs in Italy on his 17th birthday. He had lied and made it that far. When they found out who he was, they got him out of there. But I would say the average was probably in that 22 to 23 range.
No questions. Don't let the microphone scare you.
Oh, go ahead.
How did you find out all this information?
A lot of reading. And I had the privilege, the honor of knowing a lot of these men when I moved to Helen. I moved to Helen in '84. And I had been here about 2 days, and there was a knock on the door, and it was a gentleman that had heard I was in town by the name of Bob Brock. Well, Bob Brock had been in that same section, that small team that Dad was in 2nd Company, 2nd Regiment. So I went to one of the Chapter 1 meetings and got to meet Mark Radcliffe and Roy Hudson. Marilyn's father was also in the force. Joe Glass, Lauren Whaling, all of those men, and just started to have the opportunity to spend time with them. And I knew that Dad had been in some kind of unit. I didn't know what it was, and it was hard. It's still hard to find some of this information. There have been a lot of books written, but like I say, they were top secret, and I don't know, and probably we don't need to know the whole story. But it's plugging pieces together. There's just another little side note. When Russia invaded Finland in 1939, there's a book out there called Fire and Ice of how the Finns defended themselves against the Russian army in 1939, 1940. It was all these small teams on skis, hit and run, kind of like what's going on in Ukraine today a little bit. I think Winston Churchill, but I mean, I'm kind of plugging in my own perception of this. That Winston Churchill saw that, how successful the Finns were defending themselves against the Russian army. So it's just kind of plugging pieces together. I just finished a book on the Jedburghs, and they were small 3-man teams who went into southern France, and they organized the partisans, they organized the local underground to fight against the Germans and identify targets. The Forcemen had some contact with the Jeds when they were in southern France, but I've just tried to piece together those pieces of the puzzle to try to understand really what Dad was involved with, but what all these men were involved with. But I think in truth, we'll never know all of it. Didn't want to sleep on the ground anymore? Yeah. Yes, sir.
For the winter training, you didn't get into anything, but wasn't there the dog sled training going on at that time too?
There was, and they were separate from the force. And unbeknownst to either one of them, Dave Armstrong was with the dog sleds up at Remini. They were training for a mission that they really weren't sure of. The force was training for what they thought was going to be Norway. But it was years later, it was decades later, before somebody connected the dots, that the dog sleds were going to support the forcemen in Norway, had they gone to Norway. There's a snow-tracked vehicle that was developed, it didn't even exist at the time, called the Weasel, that was going to be attached to aircraft. And it was it was this 4-man track sled the Studebaker built that was going to be dropped into Norway with the dog sleds so that they could have supply chains and so they would have the support around these combat soldiers that would be operating in Norway in the snow. The Weasel was developed, and it was used a lot, both in Europe and in the Pacific. But yeah, the dogs were going to be in support of it, but they did. The forcemen knew the dogs were out there. The dog trainers knew the forcemen were here, but they didn't know that their paths were going to cross at some point in the future.
So were the Green Beret the section of the Marine Special Forces?
Green Beret is the Army. The SEALs, the Navy SEALs are the Marine Corps section of the Special Operation Forces. There are several of them that operate in that what I call unconventional. It's become more conventional over time.
I'd like to make a slight correction on that.
Okay.
SEALs are a member of the Navy.
Correct.
Okay,
I said the
not
Marines.
Marines, they're Navy.
I stand corrected.
Okay,
They are.
thank you.
They're scared to have me go past them again.
I would just like to know, when your father passed and you were going through his personal belongings, I assume, did you find anything of his relative to his service?
No. He passed when I was pretty young, and I didn't know enough to ask the questions, and I don't know that he would have told me. He was wounded in southern France from an artillery round, and it was the concussion from the round that tore him up. It wasn't the shrapnel, but they attributed his death to that, and he lived for about 15 more years after that. But the only thing I did get of his was his V-42 knife. And after he was wounded, he went to England, and he was in the hospital in England, and when he was waiting to ship back, he was out of the war. When he was waiting to ship back to the United States, he ran into his brother Ernie, who was going over in the Canadian Army, and Dad gave him his knife and said, "Here, keep this, you might need it." And so when Dad passed, Ernie brought his knife back out and gave it to me, and I have now dedicated or donated it to Fort Bragg, to the unit compound. It's in the history office at the unit compound.
Any other questions for Bill?
Right here.
Is there any chance you're writing a book?
You know, I should probably park this someplace. I have not started to write a book. The history, the commitment, when you meet these guys, you know, I could start naming names, but I would probably forget somebody. But a lot of the men that I had the chance to meet are just everyday guys. I think one thing that I'll throw in there, not to dodge the question of the book, is they've had a reunion every year since 1947. We've missed the last two because of COVID, but up to that point, every year, they would get together someplace. United States, Canada, East, West. Initially, kind of the perception that it was social, but I think in reality, it was therapeutic for these guys to get back together and be able to sit down and talk to each other. Lauren Whaling and Joe Glass, both scouts in 1st Company, 2nd Regiment, every day. And they were both from here in Helena. They checked on each other every day. They raised a lot of cane together every day, and Stoney Wine and Larry Lytle, they checked on each other every day. I think that what we're seeing a lot of in our military today, of PTSD and some of those issues that our soldiers are dealing with, men and women. I don't know that it was planned that way, that the force were going to get together. I think it was more social, but I think the therapy that came out of that annual reunion. There were 2 doctors in Canada when we had the reunion in Halifax that interviewed a lot of these forcemen for just that purpose. How did you deal with coming home? How did you transition back from combat back to civilian life? And I'm convinced that it was those reunions. And they would start planning the next reunion a year in advance, just knowing that they were going to get together and see the brotherhood. They were going to see each other again.
So because of the secrecy of the Special Forces being formed, a lot of the stories, personal stories from these men are unknown, basically?
A lot of them went with the men. There are some, I'll say, memoirs that have been written by the men, again, plugging it all together. A lot of that history is down at the History Office, the USASOC, U.S. Army Special Operations Command, down at Fort Bragg, and they've pieced a lot of it together. But a lot of those personal stories, Johnny Marshall, was very poetic, very artistic, and Pam Davidson has a scrapbook full of the letters that he wrote home. They couldn't tell anybody where they were. In fact, they didn't even identify him as the 1st Special Service Force. At first, you'd see the headlines in the paper, it would be U.S. Canadian Unit, first soldiers into Rome, or U.S. Canadian Unit lands in France, but it was never identified as the 1st Special Service Force. So our John would write letters home with writing the letter, but he would have all this artistic piece, and there's a treasure of history in that. It's that thick of letters that he wrote home.
That would be
to
so
Phyllis.
cool to go through
Yeah.
that.
And the drawings that he did.
Any
Yeah.
other questions? I'm hogging all the questions.
The books that they have, if you're a reader, I'm not trying to be a salesman for the museum, but some of the books that are out there that tell the story, plugging the pieces together. The first book that was written by Robert Burhans was The Intelligence Officer. There was a book out there by Anne Frederick Hicks, who was the daughter of General Fredericks, called The Last Fighting General. General Fredericks was wounded 9 times. He was the most shot at and hit general in the war. He had 9 Purple Hearts. She told his story. That if you're interested and you're a reader, there's a treasure of books out there on the force and on Anzio, and none of them is going to tell the whole story. They try to, and I'm running out of time now, but I have already run out of time. But if you're a reader, and it's not that hard to get on post, all you need is a pictured ID. The museum is right inside the gate. They're open every Thursday from 10 to 4,
And it is amazing.
and it's an amazing museum.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me tell the story.